Okay, we got a lot to get into. So here's lecture number 10, a new look at old warnings. You can read the disclaimers there. Do we understand the concept of fornication correctly? That's the question. First, let's summarize the general consensus among modern Christians. Most Christians believe that fornication is properly or technically defined as any sexual acts outside of the holy union of marriage between a man and a woman. Many Bible translations have now substituted the old word fornication for the broader sexual immorality to make the concept even more broad and easily understood, because the word fornication isn't technically defined anywhere in the Bible. It doesn't say this is what we mean by fornication. So if you just hear the word, you might not understand. So they just say sexual immorality, and then it's up to you to essentially figure out what sexual immorality even means, which means you basically fall back on your cultural norms of your society that you live in. If you told somebody in Japan that they can't be sexually immoral, but the age of consent in Japan is like 14, well then to them, there's nothing against that. That's not sexually immoral. And that's why I have a problem with just using the term sexual immorality. That's why this lecture is called A New Look at Old Warnings, because I want to try to get this straight. Figure out what it was really talking about and why. Sexual immorality, we're talking about the mainstream Christian understanding, it includes, according to these interpreters, all private temptations as well, lusts and desires that a person may indulge in by themselves, you know what I mean, or while married. The main piece of scripture to reinforce this notion is Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5:27. You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And if you've seen my TikTok videos, you know that I've talked about this. This warning is taken extremely seriously because of what Jesus says immediately after. This is not a different passage. This is connected to the same thing. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. That's very serious. Taken in conjunction, Jesus seems to be introducing a radical, extremist view on sexuality that teaches that it would be better to mutilate our bodies than to have private fantasies or masturbate, lest we go to hell. I mean, it doesn't really get more extreme than that. And that is sort of the backdrop of how we think about sexuality in the church. Mostly because we take these verses together. Most Christians do not literally obey Christ's command and mutilate themselves to avoid lustful thinking, and it is doubtful self-mutilation would be enough to stop such thoughts anyway, which we could talk about you could think about that, the fact that even if you pulled out your right eye, you're not going to stop having sexual thoughts. So is he actually trying to say that we should do it, or is he trying to say that your heart is the source of it all? And there's reason to think that that's the case. And so you can't cut out your heart and still live. You just need to take it very seriously. But instead, claim this is another reason why Jesus had to atone for all of our sin and why we must always be repentant of our sinful flesh. So Jesus gives this extreme warning. We say, okay, Jesus, we know what you mean, but we're not actually going to do what you say. We're going to just trust that you forgave us and then, let that be sufficient instead of actually doing what you said. This approach, what I'm talking about, this understanding of the internal sin, is that it's reinforced by a parallel teaching in the same discourse where he says about how you shall not commit murder. Whoever commits murder shall be subject to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother without cause shall be subject to judgment. Which, that's a huge difference. It used to be you could hate your brother as much as you wanted, as long as you didn't actually kill them, then you got away with it. I mean, you got away with that feeling. There's nothing to get away with because you didn't actually commit the crime. It's like today. I mean, in our modern legal society, you can't be charged with hating somebody. So you have to actually do the deed, and there has to be witnesses and a trial, and you go to jail, and that determines whether you're guilty or innocent. And he's saying that it's an internal thing, that God knows, and even just thinking the wrong way is enough. And again, with, you shall say to your brother, Raka, which means worthless, you shall be subject to the judgment of the council. But I say to you, whoever shall say, you fool, shall be subject to the fire of Gehenna, meaning like the lake of fire, hell. And so, again, it's an extreme position on something, and it turns it internally, and it connects it with the final judgment day. So there's precedent. Again, in Mark 7:21, Jesus says, for from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, there's that word, theft, murder, and adultery. And you can see sexual immorality, which in old versions of the Bible would have been called fornication, is listed separately from adultery, because fornication and adultery are two separate words. You can't interchange them when you're writing the Greek, which is what they were writing in. So the question is, why challenge this view? Even if it's not totally accurate, isn't extra purity always better for us? Shouldn't we be perfect like Jesus? You might be wondering that. Why would I make a whole lecture on this? And for the first whole part of this lecture, it's going to sound like I'm just trying to justify some sort of sin on my part, but it's going to change, and you got to stick around for that. Isn't challenging this view simply a justification or permission to sin more? I've already been accused of that on TikTok. Accuracy is always better than inaccuracy if we want to rightly divide the Word of God and learn the truth. I believe that. I think that's pretty solid. Now, you should always just want to be more accurate and see where that leads. We should not be afraid or ashamed of challenging traditions or teachings, because if we do that, if we never challenge them, we don't know whether we've been right or wrong the whole time. If we call things sin that truly aren't, we condemn the innocent and thus create needless guilt and obstacles for them and for ourselves. I think that's a real problem. There's a type of Christianity that condemns and condemns and condemns, and they'll find anything they can in the Bible, in the New Testament, and they'll turn it into a major sin, and they want you to feel guilty about it. That becomes a stumbling block. It really hinders people from serving in the kingdom. And then here's the big one for me. The true narrative, if this isn't accurate, if our traditions aren't correct, the true narrative may have been covered up by false teachers with ulterior motives. Have we ever thought of that? First of all, we don't look into it, but if we did, we probably would assume good intentions on the part of anybody who created that tradition, that understanding. So I want to revisit this warning from Jesus and see, even something as universally understood as that, if we really look at it, does it say what we think it says? It should be very easy. It should be very straightforward. Now, it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman, and the word for woman in Greek is gynaika, with lustful intent, Greek epithumio, has already committed adultery, Greek moichuo, with her in his heart. Now, what does that mean? Gynaika means a married woman, a wife, as opposed to the Greek word gyne, which was any woman. married or unmarried. You know, the word gynecologist comes from this Greek root word. It's a female doctor, a doctor that works on females. So gyne is the universal term for a female or a woman. Gynaika means a woman who is married. So the verse doesn't mean what people think it means. Because when he says everyone who looks at a woman, it actually means everyone who looks at someone else's wife. Epithumio means a strong intention to take and have what is coveted. When you look at the English translation, it says lustful intent. Again, that even in the English, if you really pay attention, you should see that intention is part of it. In the King James, it says to lust after her. And it means you're actually planning to do something about it. It's not just a fantasy that you indulge for a little bit. But in the Greek, it's more obvious. This is about intending to take what you covet. And that moichuo is just the word for adultery. That's also the word in the beginning of the verse. You know, you shall not commit adultery. And we know that adultery is only possible with a married woman. You can't commit adultery with a single woman. That just literally doesn't exist in the biblical text. So the real meaning of the verse is like this. You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that every man, married or unmarried, who looks at another man's wife with the intention of scheming to have sex with her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That is a very different meaning. And this is sort of like the backbone of our understanding of sexuality in the New Testament, is this teaching on committing adultery in your heart. But not even the New English translations go so far as to change his words to mean he's committed fornication with her in his heart, because you can't mix up the moichuo with the word for fornication. That's specifically just adultery. So, you know, his teaching wouldn't even be sensible to people if it was talking about an unmarried woman as the subject of interest, because adultery can only occur with a married woman. To teach that a man can't even look at an unclaimed potential future wife with sexual desire would be to abolish the healthy act of marriage and condemn heterosexual nature. That's how extreme it actually is, because people do get married without sexual attraction sometimes, but the vast majority of people who fall in love and want to get married are attracted to each other. And at some point, you're going to be thinking about them sexually. So this is not what Jesus was trying to do. He wasn't trying to condemn marriage or thinking about an unclaimed woman. Also, people apply this to women, but it specifically says those who look at a woman with lustful intent. So it rules out women altogether. Women can't be guilty of what Jesus is teaching here. So either that's a real double standard, if it's what people think it is, that it's just all sexual fantasies that are not appropriate, you may as well have committed it already in your heart. But it rules out women. So is it a double standard, or is it actually just a pretty logical teaching about how you shouldn't be trying to scheme to have sex with somebody else's wife? Is there, this is a typo, is there a group posing as an authority on Christianity who has such an agenda? I want to plant that idea now already, because if this is what we've been taught, which it is, then who would want to abolish marriage or condemn heterosexual nature? Now let's move on to what fornication really means. The Koine Greek word, which is what was used to write the New Testament, often used for fornication, is porneia. Porneia means fornication, which doesn't really help us because we're trying to figure out what that actually refers to. Whoredom, and being a whore, means prostitution. A whore properly, not just if you insult a woman by calling her a whore, but an actual whore is one that trades sex for money or gifts. So that's a prostitute. And idolatry. Idolatry is right in there with fornication and whoredom, according to the Greek definitions I could find. Now that's derived from or related to the word porneo. I fornicate, or I practice adultery. So again, the spin-off words are about idolatry and fornication, which, because we saw how the Old Testament handled this, it shouldn't be surprising that idolatry is mixed in, because we went through that whole metaphor of the tribe being like a woman serving God, idolatry being like fornication or prostitution, where you're supposed to be faithful and pure, but you actually let other men have you. Now, porne, which is, obviously, these are the words that get used in pornography, right? So, or pornographic. And so we believe, because of that, I've heard people preach that, the word fornication comes from the word porneia and porne, and therefore porn or pornography is just a confirmation of what we already believe, which is that all sexual sex outside of marriage is fornication. But here we're seeing that it's actually more about prostitution, or an idolatrous community. And so which one is it? Because those are not the same at all. All of this is about prostitution, whoring, offering one's body sexually for gifts. That's what pornography is, actually. It's prostitution recorded on camera. And so pornography is about the transactional part of it being a business thing. Whenever it is not literally about a prostitute, harlot, or whore, it is about an idolaters who are the spiritual equivalent, because they offer themselves as servants to other gods, idols, in exchange for gifts from those gods. You don't serve a god without expecting something in return. Nobody did that. Nobody just serves a god because they like to. I mean, we say that's how we are now, but even us, we want salvation. We want eternal life. We want blessings, even if not in this life, we want in the next. So even we try to serve God because we want something, and he expects that. That's not a rude or evil thing to say. We should want the blessings of God, so that's fine. But if you serve other gods, then you are prostituting yourself, because you are offering yourself for something in exchange. That is prostitution. So it all comes down to prostitution. It is never used for normal sex between lovers, or a man and a woman who hope to become a permanent couple. So sex before marriage between a couple who is dating or want to make it work in a long-term marriage, it is not, according to the Greek words. These are the words that are used in the Bible. And I'm not going to make a huge point about it because we have so much else to talk about. But I need you to understand right away that fornication, you cannot just use that word or say that the Bible condemns that, because there's no example of that being condemned. And wherever the word is used, it's either related to whores and harlots and prostitutes, or idolaters who are the spiritual equivalent. We got to keep moving here because we got so much to talk about. Just as in the Old Testament, where adultery with somebody else's wife or unfaithfulness of a betrothed woman was condemned, but normal sex between lovers was not, the term used in the New Testament does not condemn generic lovers who are unmarried, but rather prostitution. Now we get pornos. Now this, the definition of pornos, which is one of these varying words used in the New Testament, I think 10 times it's used. It's always just translated like fornicator or, sexually immoral. This is all gets lumped in. We looked at a bunch of different words already. This all just is fornication, 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 and here fornication again, but they have different subtle meanings. This one is especially different because this one is specifically a man who prostitutes himself. Did you know that? I guarantee you didn't know that. And pornos, different translation, a different study of the Greek. And these words exist outside of the Bible, by the way. So you don't have to guess how it was used. It was used outside of the Bible to describe things in the Greek world. People wrote poems, they wrote laws, they wrote about these things. So it's actually very easy to confirm that we don't have to guess. This is about prostitution. And here, pornos, it does mean a man who prostitutes his body to another's lust for hire, a male prostitute. You can go look that up. Now, where do we get, this is just translated fornication or fornicator? What have we been missing? Why would they use specific terms in the Greek for something as specific as a male prostitute who hires himself to someone else for sex and money, and then we just have the generic term fornication? I'm troubled by this. It all derives from the root word pernemi, which means to sell. Get that. What do you think about that? To sell. It's akin to the base piprasko. It means a male prostitute as venal. Is this some kind of bizarre joke? This doesn't sound right at all. What are we talking about now? We're talking about a male prostitute? How does that make any sense? We went from every sexual thought that a man has, he should be cutting off his body parts or else he goes to hell. And now when we actually look at the terms, we're seeing, well, first of all, that verse was all just about adultery. It wasn't even about fornication. And now when we're getting into the fornication, we're talking about prostitutes and whores and now male prostitutes. It doesn't seem right at all. Men don't become prostitutes. Women don't hire men for sex. Especially in the old world. How would that make any sense? Male-dominated society and women have to hire men for sex? Is that really what they're talking about? A male prostitute? And men don't hire men for sex. They would just have sex. They wouldn't have to hire each other, right? So you may assume this can't be the real interpretation. Whatever the word pornos, even though it's used in the New Testament, that's not what it actually means. I must be stupid. I must be totally misunderstanding this whole thing. And I want you to appreciate your current mindset because it's going to change by the end of this lecture. And realize other people are in the same position as you and me, thinking that this, even if you told them this, they wouldn't believe you. The intended audience of the New Testament, we assume they must have been meant to understand it as some sort of innuendo or for a more broad point about sexual purity in general. That's why it gets translated as sexual immorality, right? Or fornication. It can't be about actual male prostitution. So let's go to Timothy, 1 Timothy 1, verse 9 to 11. He says, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, there's the word, which is pornois, and then very next word, men who practice homosexuality. It's one word in the Greek, but in English we have to break it up to get the point across. Arsenokoites, enslavers, liars, perjurers, whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the gospel, and so on. So sexually immoral is pornois, and then immediately after, men who practice homosexuality. Now, in the old term, in the fornication term that we don't really look into or understand, or right here, English Standard Version, sexually immoral, the most vague thing you could ever think of. Any sexuality that is vaguely immoral versus what are we actually talking about? We just barely saw pornos means male prostitute. Now here we have men who practice homosexuality connected directly with it. In case you needed extra clarity, arsenokoites means a sodomite, a male engaging in same-gender sexual activity, a sodomite, or a pederast. Now, wait a second. What are we talking about now? The verses, we thought we knew exactly what this meant. Sexually immoral and homosexuals. But now, arsenokoites actually means pederast as well. And remember, these are not exclusive words to the New Testament. So we should be able to look at other Greek texts and see if this is how it was meant, how the audience would have understood it when he used this word. In case you didn't know, a pederast is a man who has sexual relations, especially anal intercourse, with a boy. We're talking about pedophiles. That's what arsenokoites mean, and that's what is listed right there in 1 Timothy. So if we don't understand that, if that's been downplayed or softened through the language and translations to the point where it's just, even, for as bad as it is to say men who practice homosexuality, it actually could be even worse than that. And so we have the sexual immorality being translated generically as fornication, and who knows what that means. Now we're seeing it's actually quite different. How would this change our understanding of classic verses? I want to go through some more verses. Romans 13:9, English Standard Version. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Stealing, murdering, coveting, and committing adultery are all not loving your fellow neighbor, or your fellow man, as yourself, because you are not respecting his property the way you would want your property respected. This is not I'm not trying to shock you with this teaching. This is just, I'm proving a point here that he's saying that this is about respecting your neighbor, and that even adultery is included in that. The whole law is about respecting what another man has and being content with what you get on your own, not restricting men from having available women. So when he says, here's a classic verse, they're summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's not saying you can't think about other women, because that has nothing to do with that. Therefore, normal prostitution and normal lovers are not a transgression against any neighbor or fellow man, because the woman involved is not claimed by another man. So, if you're not even that, I find that fascinating to look at it again. And I know how bad this sounds. I know it sounds like I'm just trying to justify whatever, but I mean, I'm a virgin. I'm not even trying to have casual sex. So, this isn't about me. I'm trying to help you and just help all of us appreciate what the actual Bible meant. Summing up, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That is why fornication, and as we understand it, sex outside of marriage doesn't make any sense as this transgression, because you're not disrespecting any other man. On the other hand, in Leviticus 18, we have, you shall not lie with a male, meaning man or boy, as with a woman. It is an abomination. The act of homosexuality is called an abomination by God. For God to remain outspokenly against pederasty and homosexuality in his congregation is perfectly logical. But for God to become suddenly extremist about even internal thoughts between unmarried men and women would be a huge reversal of the natural order. And that's why we have the lectures leading up to this one showing just how nonchalantly he handled the idea of a man having multiple women, wanting to take a woman, having to deal with her father. At no point was there just this sort of condemnation of lovers, or, even prostitution wasn't really condemned unless it was a special person like a daughter of a priest or something. It was shameful for the woman, but the men weren't even condemned for going to a prostitute. And so this change that we think happens in the New Testament would be a giant reversal, whereas the homosexuality part is actually very consistent. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. For God will judge the sexually immoral, pornos, this right here, English Standard Version, sexually immoral, they just nicely wash over it. No, we're not going to tell you what that actually means. Sexually immoral, that's all you need to know. Pornos, therefore, just anyone who's sexually immoral. We don't want to say what it means. Oh, it actually means male prostitute and adulteress. Now there we have adultery and male prostitution. Those are things God really hates. Death sentence in the Old Testament. There was no death sentence for having heterosexual sex with a woman in the Old Testament, unless it was somebody else's wife or there was some special circumstance that added to it. So this, if you understand pornos, the word used there, we saw it means male prostitute. He's saying, let marriage be held in honor, the bed undefiled, for God will judge, meaning this is a serious punishment even in the New Testament, male prostitutes and adulterers. Here's 1 Corinthians. Food is meant for the stomach, and stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality. There we go again. Porneia, prostitution. Whoredom, harlotry. But for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So there again, if we actually use the term prostitution there instead of sexually immoral, think about how that would change. I'm not changing these verses. I want you to really understand that. I know it sounds like I am, and I'm stretching it, and I'm trying to twist it all around. But the word porneia and all of that we saw where the root came down from, it derives at its base from the word selling. Selling. If you have a garage sale, your pornoing your stuff away. I mean, this is how the Greek words are used. The root of it all is not sex. The root of it all is selling. And to sell your body is where the rest of the words come from. Pornos is the male version of selling your body sexually. We'll see there's a different word that specifically is about the female prostitute. Porneia is anyone in general acting like a prostitute or having, being a prostitute. So yes, this verse is serious, but it's not about lovers, marriage bed, and, in this case, the verse is about the body not being meant for sexual immorality. I mean, I don't have the verse here, but we know that it actually says in, I believe, Romans, that they were bad because, guilty because they put aside the natural use of a woman and they burned in lust towards one another. Men with men. So it's actually, they're condemned for not using women sexually. And so for here to say the body's not meant for sexual immorality actually means, yes, women are meant to be used sexually. I mean, that's why they have reproductive organs that are compatible with men. And not sexual immorality as we understand it, being even thinking about a woman is evil, and therefore we have to guard ourselves against having any thoughts. This is actually talking about being a real prostitute in real life, not just in the theory of it, or the feeling of it, or the inner temptation of it. Here's, is this the same? Yeah, this is just a couple verses later. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Oh, see here, they translated prostitute correctly. But this means female prostitute, pornis, as opposed to pornos. Pornos is a man, pornis is a female prostitute. So here, they don't translate sexual immorality. They actually say what it really is, a prostitute. Why don't they always do that? Why do they change it around sometimes? It says never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is written, the two will become one flesh. Clearly, Christians are not supposed to engage in prostitution at all. Although it specifies that God will judge the male prostitutes, it only seems to encourage a departure from heterosexual prostitution by means of encouragement and analogy. If you look at what it says here, it doesn't say God is going to judge these prostitutes and God is going to judge anyone who engages in prostitution. It is trying to make an argument saying, hey, consider your bodies to be sacred and joined with Christ, and so don't engage in prostitution because that's like defiling yourself. It's a softer tone. They're making an analogy. It's not just straight up warnings about judgment. One kind of prostitution is much worse than the other. That's just how it is. Flee from sexual immorality, they say, but it means pornein, prostitution. So flee from prostitution. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body. But the sexually immoral person, porneion, the one who prostitutes, sins against his own body. Now this is interesting to me because the sexually immoral person sinning against his own body kind of implies that he is the one prostituting and not the woman that he visits. And if you think I'm making a very tight argument about the exact terminology, I have it all figured out, I'm not saying I do. I'm just reopening this discussion or opening it for the first time so that you can think about it. I'm explaining it where I am at thinking about this. there's just a fact that this all comes down to prostitution and selling, and therefore, when he's talking about every other sin is committed outside the body, but the sexually immoral person, I just don't like that these translations never use prostitution unless, like in this other one, it's a female prostitute. Then suddenly they make it very clear. But it's like they don't want to acknowledge that there even is such a thing as a male prostitute. Here it says he's sinning against his own body. For this is the will of God, your sanctification. This is 1 Thessalonians. That you abstain from sexual immorality. What is the actual word? Porneus. Being a prostitute. Abstain from that. That each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. That no one transgress and wrong his brother in this matter, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things. Now here we come with the vengeance again. This is a serious warning. This is not just an encouragement or an analogy. As we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you. So these Thessalonians are getting a very clear warning here. Abstain from being a prostitute, that each of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like Gentiles who do not know God. So that says something about the other Gentiles, doesn't it? Apparently they are prostituting themselves. That no one transgress and wrong his brother. This type of transgression against a fellow brother is something that the Lord will avenge, which they were given solemn warnings about. This type of transgression is also common among Gentiles who do not know God. We're deriving this from the verses. How can a man offend his brother by fornication, or sexual immorality, as they say, if fornication is about private thoughts about available women, or sexuality between a man and a single woman? How can I possibly offend my brother if I go to a different woman and have sex with her? Something is missing here. What type of men were these Greeks? This is where you got to strap in. Christians today have no clue about the reality of Greek male sexuality at the time Paul was writing to them. Oh boy, we're already at 40 minutes. There's a lot to go through here. I am taking I don't want you to believe that this is me saying it, okay? I'm not inventing a story. This is from Wikipedia, and they are not a Christian organization. They are not trying to create a new narrative, and if they are, they're still ending up here. So, Greek love. You can look up the article called Greek Love in Wikipedia, and I'm just taking screenshots, and I'm going to show you. Greek love is a term originally used by classicists to describe the primarily homoerotic customs, practices, and attitudes of the ancient Greeks. Homoerotic. It was frequently used as a euphemism for homosexuality and pederasty. The phrase is a product of the enormous impact of the reception of classical Greek culture on historical attitudes towards sexuality and its influence on art and various intellectual movements. This term, Greek love, this is how embedded it is in Greek culture. It defines them. Pederasty, which is an older man having sex with a boy, and homosexuality is just called Greek love. There is no heterosexuality in Greek love. Think about that. Oh, we're not done yet. We're just getting started. This article just keeps going on, so I'm going to keep I'm going to keep telling you about it because, much like how I had to hammer the point home in the last couple lectures, I do not want you to misunderstand the severity of this and how far away from the reality we have gotten in our understanding of what the New Testament was really trying to say. That's why this lecture is called A New Look at Old Warnings. Wikipedia goes on. Greece, as the historical memory of a treasured past, was romanticized and idealized as a time and a culture when love between males was not only tolerated, but actually encouraged. What? What? Greek culture? Are you serious? I thought Greek culture was about great discoveries and amazing philosophers. Greece was idealized, love between males was not only tolerated, but actually encouraged, expressed as a high ideal of same-sex camaraderie. Well, maybe it's not talking about homosexuality and homoeroticism at all, right? If tolerance and approval of male homosexuality had happened once, and in a culture so admired and imitated by the 18th and 19th centuries, that's the 1700s, might it not be possible to replicate in modernity the antique homeland of the non-heteronormative? What are we talking about? They're talking about how, to this day, this is still a continuation of the idea of Greek love. Greek love has continued throughout centuries, millennium, actually, 2,000 years. When somebody talks about Greek love, they still mean homosexuality. That's how pervasive it is. As in modern English and other modern European languages, Greek love refers to various, mostly homoerotic, practices as part of the Hellenic heritage, reinterpreted by adherents such as blah, blah, blah. Often quotation marks are used to indicate usage of the phrase that is determined by context. It often serves as a coded phrase for pederasty, or to sanitize homosexual desire in historical contexts where it was considered unacceptable. So, when someone talks about Greek love, and you hear some philosopher saying, "Oh yes, I have indulged in Greek love" or something, they're talking about pedophilia. Yeah, that's Greek love. And this is talking about the Hellenic age when Paul was writing. The German term, whatever, Greek love, appears in German literature between 1750 and 1850, along with Socratic love, and Platonic love, in reference to male-male attractions. Okay, so even Socrates and Plato, Socratic love. You heard about Platonic love. Ancient Greece became a positive reference point by which homosexual men of a certain class and education, very important men, could engage in discourse that might otherwise be taboo. Oh, yes. We can't let the peasants know that we're actually talking about being pedophiles and homosexuals. We must say we have Platonic love and Socratic love and Greek love. That way they won't know what we're talking about, because only we understand Greek. We read these ancient Greek writings and we understand that, oh boy, these guys were all gay and they're pedophiles. But instead of telling people that, because the average person would not like that, we're going to just use these code words. That's what it's trying to explain here. In the early modern period, a disjuncture was carefully maintained between an idealized male eros in the classical tradition, which was treated with reverence, and sodomy, which was a term of contempt. So when they wanted to hide it, they would say Greek love. And when they wanted to condemn something, they would call it sodomy. So we all know sodomy is evil, but did you know that Greek love is synonymous with pedophilia? Why is this not displaying properly? Hang on a second. This should be... There we go. Fixed it. So here we go again. Now this is the main article, not Greek love, but the main article of pederasty in ancient Greece. What does it say? What is the first thing Wikipedia says about this? It was a socially acknowledged romantic relationship between an adult male and a younger male, usually in his teens. It was characteristic of the archaic and classical periods by biblical times. The influence of pederasty on Greek culture of these periods was so pervasive that it has been called the principal cultural model for free relationships between citizens. Are you kidding me? Nobody knows this? I have never been told this. I had to look this up. I'm looking up the Greek words. I got here by looking at the actual Greek words in the New Testament. Pornos. You look it up. What? Pederasty? Pederasty in Greek? I go look it up. Boom, here I am. It's so pervasive that it's been called the principal cultural model for free relationships between all citizens. It was idealized in Greece. Pedophilia was idealized in the Greek culture. I have to just keep moving on. Here's an actual picture, though, where they're showing it in their paintings and murals. They love it. Now keep in mind that the reason we have endless documentation about pederasty in Greece is because it was so extremely central to their culture and society, even celebrated and recognized in poetry, art, sculptures, and Greek rituals and mythology. That's why we have such a massive record of it, is because it was not a hidden taboo. It was actually the opposite of taboo. It was considered the fundamental model of how to live. Some scholars locate its origin, this is pederasty in Greece, particularly in rites of passage in Crete, where it was associated with the entrance into military life and the religion of Zeus. Baked into the middle of their religion. It has no formal existence in the Homeric epics and seems to have developed in the 7th century BC. This is 700 years before Jesus, as an aspect of Greek homosocial culture, which was characterized also by athletic and artistic nudity. You know, the Olympics, the gymnastics. It was all about naked men competing with each other athletically. They loved it. Delayed marriage for aristocrats. Oh, no, you don't want to get married to a woman too early. You got to have fun first with men and boys. Symposia. There you go again. Social seclusion of women. Oops. Social seclusion of women. You go out in town, you go out with all these guys, and you actually exclude and seclude women away from what the men are doing. That's how twisted Greek culture was. Pederasty was both idealized and criticized in ancient literature and philosophy. And I've seen some of that criticism, and it's not the criticism you think. The argument has recently been made that the idealization was universal in the archaic period. Criticism began in Athens as part of the general classical Athenian reassessment of archaic culture. Plato talks about how when a man kisses a boy, he should kiss him more like a father kisses his son, and try to restrain it to just that and resist the temptation to do more. That's the criticism. It's openly acknowledging this is Plato, one of the greatest scholars and philosophers of Greece. Most evidence indicates that to be an eligible eromenos, a youth would be of an age when an aristocrat began his formal military training, that is, from 15 to 17. As an indication of physical maturity, the eromenos was sometimes as tall or taller than the older Erastes, and may have his first facial hair. The word used by the Greeks for the younger sexual participant was paidika, a neuter plural adjective, things having to do with children, treated syntactically as a masculine singular. In poetry and philosophical culture, the eromenos is often an embodiment of idealized youth. A related ideal depiction of youth in archaic culture was the kouros, long-haired male in statuary nude. So they had all these statues of naked boys, just like modern Renaissance culture. You go to fountains and you see the naked boy peeing into the fountain, and you see the sculptures of Leonardo and all of these great Renaissance sculptures, and we're supposed to believe that's just harmless, I guess, artistic integrity. But oops, in actual Greece, they did the same thing, and it was all about pedophilia. So it goes on talking about this. A beautiful creature without possessing needs of his own. He is aware of his attractiveness, but self-absorbed in his relationship with those who desire him. He will smile sweetly at the admiring lover. He's not talking about a woman here. He will show appreciation for the other's friendship, advice, and assistance. He will allow the lover to greet him by touching affectionately his genitals and his face, while he looks himself demurely at the ground. The inner experience of an eromenos would be characterized, we may imagine, by the feeling of proud self-sufficiency. This is, if you're disgusted by this, I want you to understand how Paul felt. This was the people he was preaching to. This is why we have to actually understand what the Bible is trying to say. Is it trying to say that we can't think about a woman? Is sexual immorality what we've been taught? I'm just going to keep going. He is not himself in need of anything beyond himself. He is unwilling to let himself be explored by others' needy curiosity, and he has himself little curiosity about the other. He is something like a god or a statue of a god. So this is like a poetic analysis of how things were in Greek when poets would write about this stuff. They would think about the ideal teenage boy being somebody who you could go up to and fondle, and they wouldn't even care, and they would just be totally content and just ignore it. And just are you listening to? This is Wikipedia. This is not some crazy guy's, rant that he wrote about what it was like and how it was all about pederasty back then. No, scholars, citations are given. Scholars, they're not even condemning this. We're supposed to, if you read Wikipedia articles on this, you're supposed to believe this is the height of sophistication. This is what the elites have always admired. And they don't tell us. Dover insisted that the active role of the Erastes and the passivity of the Eromenos is a distinction. I love how they keep using these fancy Greek terms. The pedophile and the victim is what it actually should say. And I'm just going to use that. Dover insisted that the active role of the pedophile and the passivity of the victim is a distinction of the highest importance. But subsequent scholars have tried to present a more varied picture of the behaviors and values associated with pedophilia, pederasty. Although ancient Greek writers used Erastes and Eromenos in a pederastic context, the words are not technical terms for social roles and can refer to the lover and beloved in a hetero and homosexual couples. Okay. Origins, another section. Greek practice of pederasty came suddenly into prominence at the end of the archaic period of Greek history. There is a brass plaque from Crete about 650 BC, which is the oldest surviving representation of pederastic custom. Now, before it gets, I want you to understand, before it would get put into brass plaques, it would have to be pretty popular, wouldn't it? It wouldn't just, if everybody hated it and you were going to be killed for doing it, you wouldn't be making brass plaques about it. So before you start engraving it as something you celebrate, you have to first normalize it. It has to be considered something good. So obviously before 650, it was already happening. But we just have the evidence of when it was, the earliest evidence we have. There might have been a lot more before that. We just don't have it. So the oldest surviving representation is that old, which probably means that there was a lot of it if something managed to survive like that. And certainly no one came by and destroyed it. There's a lot you can read between the lines here. Such representations appear all over Greece in the next century. Literary sources show it as being established custom in many cities by the 5th century BC. Established custom. Pederasty. Pederasty is a old man having sex with a boy. Established custom by the 5th century BC. Cretan pederasty as a social institution seems to have been grounded in an initiation which involved abduction, kidnapping, raping. A man selected a youth, enlisted the chosen one's friends to help him, and carried off the subject of his affections to his andreion, a sort of men's club or meeting hall. I wonder if this is still the same today. The youth received gifts, and the philetor, along with his friends, I love the coded language they still use in Wikipedia. Just drop the act. Admit what you're actually talking about. But no, it's cultural. This is very fancy and sophisticated and good. Along with the friends went away with him for 2 months into the countryside, where they hunted and feasted. At the end of this time, the philetor presented the youth with 3 contractually required gifts: military attire, an ox, and a drinking cup. Other costly gifts followed. Upon the return to the city, the youth sacrificed the ox to Zeus, and his friends joined him at the feast. He received special clothing that, in adult life, marked him as Kleinos, famous, renowned. The initiate was called a paresthesis, whatever, he who stands beside, perhaps because, like Ganymede, the cupbearer of Zeus, he stood at the side of the philetor during meals, and the andreion served him from the cup that he'd been ceremonially presented. So, abduction, kidnapping, this romantic getaway into the forest with hunting and an ox. It's an initiation ritual, a pedophilic seduction rite baked into their myth with Zeus worship. Social aspects. The Erastes-Eromonos relationship played a role in the classical Greek social and educational systems. This isn't just something on the side. Had its own complex social sexual etiquette and was an important social institution among the upper classes. An important social institution among the upper classes. I want you to drill that into your head, because you're going to go back and read the New Testament and see what it actually is saying. Pederasty has been understood as educative. I don't even want to read this. And Greek authors from Aristophanes to Pindar felt it naturally present in the context of an aristocratic education. So you couldn't be considered educated as a man if you weren't raped by an older man. In general, pederasty, as described in Greek literary sources, is an institution reserved for free citizens, perhaps to be regarded as a dyadic mentorship. Pederasty was widely accepted in Greece as part of the male's coming of age, even if its function is still widely debated. Here's another sculpture that exists. It still survives. That's how prevalent it was. And continuing with the social aspects, in Crete, in order to in order for the suitor to carry out the ritual abduction, the father had to approve him as worthy of the honor. Now, this is interesting because it goes back to what I said about the ancient way of thinking about daughters. That's how you would do it with a daughter. You would have to get the father's permission before you could take his daughter. And in Greece, it was the same way, but they used boys. And fathers would accept this. Fathers did not kill the men who were trying to take their son for sex. They would allow it. It was a promotion into the military and the academic circles. It's an honor for some old pedophile to come by and try to take your son. Do you see where modern secret societies get their ideas? They didn't come up with it themselves. This is the culture that the New Testament was written for. Among the Athenians, as Socrates claims in Xenophon's Symposium, nothing of what concerns the boy is kept hidden from the father by the ideal lover. So an ideal lover tells the father all the crazy crap he's going to do with his son. In order to protect the sons from inappropriate attempts at seduction, fathers appointed slaves called pedagogues to watch over their sons. Pedagogue is what we use as the modern term for a teacher, a school teacher, a pedagogue. It was like a personal teacher. That has its roots in slaves. If you ever hear the word pedagogue again, I want you to think about the fact that that word came from slaves that fathers would appoint to their boys to prevent old pedophiles from kidnapping them. Not because they wanted to condemn, put on trial, and kill the abominable pedophiles and expose their secret society and their cult. No, just because they knew that it was so tempting and they wanted to do it the proper way through the initiation ritual, the ritual abduction. They wanted the romantic fulfillment. They wanted their son to be able to enjoy the whole process of the ritual. However, according to whatever, Athenian fathers would pray that their sons would be handsome and attractive, with the full knowledge that they would then attract the attention of men and be the objects of fights because of erotic passions. The age range when boys entered into such relationships was consonant with that of the Greek girls given in marriage, often to adult husbands, many years their senior. Boys, however, usually had to be courted. What? Isn't that backwards? You don't court the girls, you court the boys. They had to be courted and were free to choose their mate, while marriages for girls were arranged for economic and political advantage at the discretion of the father and the suitor. These connections were also an advantage for a youth and his family. And it goes on. So there you see exactly what I was saying about how it worked in the ancient world. The father has children. He knows that men want them, and they barter with them. They bargain with them. They make arranged marriages. It's confirming all of that, but in Greece, you can see the other side of it. And think about how that would sound to a god that wrote Leviticus. In parts of Greece, pederasty was an acceptable form of homoeroticism that had other less socially accepted manifestations, such as the sexual use of slaves or being a pornos, prostitute, or heteros, male equivalent of a hetaira. That word pornos we saw in the New Testament. I told you. These words exist outside of the New Testament. It is, I don't want I don't want to accuse Bible translators. We're going to get into that next lecture. But just know that the word used in the New Testament, translated as just sexual immoral, fornicator, who knows what it means? It probably refers to you, right? It's probably me and you that it's talking about. We're all sinners. We're all equally sinful of the same sins. We all have the same guilt. Yeah, and Jesus said you shouldn't even look at a woman, so you're the most guilty because you once looked at a woman when you're 13 years old in puberty and you thought you wanted to have sex with her. So you're as guilty of adultery as anyone else. And, over here it uses the word pornos, but we'll just call that a fornicator too. What is going on? Male prostitution was treated as a perfectly routine matter, and visiting prostitutes of either sex was considered completely acceptable for a male citizen. This is also true of pretty much every other civilization, except the part about either sex. Prostitution was just not considered weird. However, adolescent citizens of free status, now we're talking about adolescents here, who prostituted themselves were sometimes ridiculed and were permanently prohibited by Attic law from performing some 7 official functions. Okay, so what that tells us is that adolescents were prostituting themselves so much that they had to make laws about it. I don't know if we have any laws about that. Young people prostituting themselves and how somebody who does that can't become this and this kind of official. How prevalent does it have to be in order for you to have to make laws about it and say these specific official functions, we can't have those people in there? We know that they prostituted themselves as adolescents. Why? Because it was believed that they had sold their own body for the pleasure of others. They would not hesitate to sell their interests of their community as a whole. It was actually nothing to do with the immorality of what they did. The fact that they were a male adolescent prostitute was nothing to them. It was the fact that they might also sell off Greek interests to a foreign dignitary if they're used to selling themselves, and then someone from Arabia or some other Rome or something comes by and they offer them money and they get wound up in prostituting themselves to this dignitary, they might sell out Greece. That's the reason. If they or an adult citizen of free status who had prostituted himself performed any of the official functions prohibited to them by law, they were liable to prosecution and punishment. That's all, though. Doing it, being the prostitute, that's not punishable. However, if they did not perform those specific functions, did not present themselves for the allocation of those functions, and declared themselves ineligible, if they were somehow mistakenly elected to perform those specific functions, they were safe from prosecution and punishment. As a non-citizen visiting or residing in a city-state could not perform official functions in any case whatsoever, they could prostitute themselves as much as they wanted. Here's another section. Creative expression, visual arts. Greek vase painting is a major source for scholars seeking to understand the attitudes and practices associated with pederasty. Of course, they use the fancy Greek word. We would want to soil it with sodomy and the negative words that people are familiar with. We have to use the fancy words that the Greeks used. Hundreds of pederastic scenes are depicted on Attic black figure vases in the early 20th century. John Beazley classified pederastic vases into 3 types. This is how many there are. They have to start classifying them. The Erastes and the Eromonos facing each other. The Erastes, knees bent, reaches with one hand for the beloved's chin, with the other for his genitals. The Erastes present with Eromonos in a small gift, sometimes an animal. Oh, they present a nice little animal to the victim. Standing lovers engage in intercrural sex. I'm not even going to touch on what that is. I looked it up. It's almost threw up. Ancient Rome. Now we're not talking about just Rome, but this is so connected with Greek love and Greek pederasty that we actually have to, that it has its own section. In Latin, not Greece, not Greek, mos Graecii or mos Graecorum, Greek custom or ways of the Greek, or way of the Greeks, refers to a variety of behaviors to the ancient Romans regarded as Greek, including but not confined to sexual practice. Homosexual behaviors at Rome were acceptable only within an inherently unequal relationship. So Rome is importing Greek homosexuality. That's how prevalent it is in Greece. And as we know, Greece imports cultures from other people and incorporates it. Male Roman citizens retained their masculinity as long as they took the active penetrating role and the appropriate male sexual partner was a prostitute or slave, who would nearly always be non-Roman. So connect the dots. A non-Roman is a Greek. The prostitute, teenage Greek males prostituting themselves to powerful Romans, was considered beneficial on both sides of the culture. Because as long as the Roman in charge was penetrating and was unequally powerful over the Greek boy, then neither side would complain. We're talking about, you know what we're talking about. In archaic and classical Greece, pederasty has been a formal social relationship between freeborn males, taken out of context and refashioned as a luxury product of a conquered people. Pederasty came to express roles based on domination and exploitation. Slaves often were given, and prostitutes sometimes assumed, Greek names, regardless of their ethnic origin. The boys to whom poet Martial is attracted have Greek names. So, it is so entirely associated with the core of Greek culture that when Roman boys prostitute themselves to older Greek pedophiles, Roman pedophiles, they use Greek names. So that it seems like, because ethnically they're not that different. But if they have a Greek name, then it seems okay and you won't get suspected as much. The use of slaves defined Roman pederasty. Sexual practices were somehow Greek when they were directed at freeborn boys openly courted in accordance with Hellenic tradition of pederasty. What is this? By the close of the 2nd century BC, we're getting really close to Jesus' time. However, the elevation of Greek literature and art as models of expression caused homoeroticism to be regarded as urbane and sophisticated. So it went from this, complete circus of lust and prostitution and self-prostituting and abduction and ritual rites and fathers giving away their boys to old rich men who wanted to have them. And it became more of a sophisticated art sort of world. The literary ideal celebrated by Catullus stands in contrast to the practice of elite Romans who kept a exquisite boy as a form of high-status sexual consumption, a practice that continued well into the imperial era. I believe that's, I'm not going to pretend to know offhand where the imperial era technically started according to Wikipedia. This exquisite boy was a slave chosen from the pages who served in a high-ranking household. He was selected for his good looks and grace to serve at his master's side, where he is often depicted in art. Among his duties at a convivium he would enact a Greek mythological role of Ganymede, the cupbearer for Zeus, the Trojan youth abducted by Zeus to serve as his divine cupbearer. Attacks on emperors such as Nero and Elagabalus, whose young male partners accompanied them in public official ceremonies, criticized the perceived Greekness of male-male sexuality. Greek love, or cultural model of Greek pederasty, in ancient Rome is a topos, or literary game, that never stops being Greek in the Roman imagination. So Rome always did it, but pretended like it was a Greek thing, not a Roman thing. An erotic pose to be distinguished from the varieties of real-world sexuality among individuals. Vogt sees views, blah, 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 opposite extremes on the subject. So, Nero had these young male partners, and they didn't want to be perceived as being Greek. I guess that's what it's saying. Nero, of course, killed many, many Christians. Now we'll go forward to the Renaissance, because that's all ancient world stuff. We've already proven beyond a doubt that the New Testament period, what they were writing about was actual male prostitution, not the stuff that we've been told. So let's go forward to the Renaissance. The Renaissance means revival. And the thing that it was a revival of is Greco-Roman culture. So don't be surprised when this continues. This is still in the article for Greek pederasty. Renaissance. Male same-sex relationships of this kind portrayed by the Greek love ideal were increasingly disallowed within Judeo-Christian traditions of Western society. Well, no kidding. In the post-classical period, love poetry addressed by males to other males has been in general taboo. Oh, wow. According to Reeser's book, Setting Plato Straight, it was the Renaissance that shifted the idea of Plato's sense to what we now refer to as platonic love, asexual or heterosexual. Basically, they disguised the word so that they could keep using it while still doing it. But they wanted the average person to not realize that when they say platonic love, the average person is supposed to believe that just means you're good friends. I've used the word platonic. I didn't know where it came from. I just knew the general usage. Now I'm seeing where it came from. In his commentary on Plato, Ficino interprets amor platonicus, platonic love, and amor Socratis, Socratic love, allegorically as an idealized male love, keeping with the church doctrine of his time. See, we're talking about a time when the Inquisition was happening, the Catholic Inquisition. Ficino's interpretation of Symposium influenced a philosophical view that the pursuit of knowledge, particularly self-knowledge, required the sublimation of sexual desire, meaning you basically conquer it and, rein it in. Ficino thus began the historical process of suppressing the homoeroticism of, in particular, the dialogue of Charmides threatens to expose the carnal nature of Greek love, which Ficino sought to minimize. So there's this whole thing in the Renaissance where they're getting all these ancient Greek texts from Byzantine, from the Orthodox, and all the scholars and rich people are buying them and reading them and copying the manuscripts. And as they're reading them, they're loving all the poetry and philosophy. It's this great awakening. That's what the Renaissance is all known for. But along with that, right at the very core of it is pederasty. And so it gets reintroduced at the time when the Catholic Church, Dark Ages, is at its height. And so anybody who wants to pursue the Greek and Roman ideals and revive that old-fashioned greatness of Rome and all these Leonardo da Vinci, all these guys, they're all homosexuals, and they're playing with it because they're doing church murals. Oh, of course, the little baby cherubs all over the Sistine Chapel are naked babies all over the art of Catholic mural. Suddenly, you're seeing the dots connect here. It doesn't go away. It just keeps evolving. During the Renaissance, artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo used Plato's philosophy as an inspiration for some of their greatest works. The rediscovery of classical antiquity was perceived as a liberating experience, and Greek love, meaning pederasty, as an ideal after a Platonic model. Michelangelo presented himself to the public as a Platonic lover of men, combining Catholic orthodoxy and pagan enthusiasm in his portrayal of the male form, notably of David. No, he was homosexual. And, if you actually research it, it's very obvious that they had young boys that they were abusing. But his great-nephew edited his poems to diminish references to his love for Tommaso whatever. So, again, there's been a whitewashing of these artists. You're taught them in school as just being great artists. They don't want you to know what they're actually talking about. Okay, so, boy. Now let's revisit Paul's teaching and appreciate his impossible task. That's what I want to do. I want to appreciate Paul because that man really had to do the impossible. Look at Romans 13. In any other commandment, you are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, fellow man. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. What is he saying? Paul must somehow get ignorant Roman and Greek victims of pederasty, who are caught in a cycle of abuse and abusing, to understand the difference between brotherly love and Greek love they are so comfortable with. That verse, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Very clever what Paul is doing. To say that love fulfills the law and wouldn't transgress a fellow brother is a play on words, flipping the concept they would have been familiar with. Because we just barely saw all of that documentation about how it was an ideal in their society, so they would have been familiar with the idea of the male love, the brotherly love. And Paul now uses that term they're familiar with, that concept they're familiar with, and says, actually, if you really love your brother, you don't abuse yourself with them. Loving your neighbor as yourself, you don't do wrong to your neighbor. It's wrong to do pederasty. And so actually you've been used by people who didn't love you. He's teaching them that the society they came from is abusive and didn't actually love them. Fulfilling the law through chastity and restraint and not doing such things to each other is really where love comes in. Romans 13. This is continuing basically directly from there. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies, komois, carousing, feasting. Actually, orgies there, in that case, even though it sounds worse than it really is when you look at the Greek word, because the word actually just means carousing and feasting, like a big boisterous gathering of feasting. And drunkenness, not in sexual immorality. There we go again with the generic term they use, which in that case means koiti, or is the Greek word koiti, which is where we get the word coitus. So that's really, sex. And sensuality, eselgeia, or debauchery. So that's a very derogatory thing. Not in quarreling and jealousy, because remember, jealousy and provoking other men to be jealous. A boy being handsome and getting multiple men to fight over him was core to their culture. So quarreling and jealousy is baked into the Greek notion of what it means to be a youth or a man, a young man. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. Greek teenagers were addicted to being abused and abusing themselves, selling themselves, and gratifying their flesh with only the satanic Greek sense of dignity and chastity, because they actually had this bizarre, evil sense of how they were still being pure and dignified, and there was nothing shameful about it because they had these sophisticated rules and culture and traditions, and it was tied in with Zeus, and they dressed it up so much for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, like 800 years. By the time we get into after Christ, it's like 800 years of pedophilia and the culture dressing it up in more and more elaborate ways to make it sound like it's a good thing. And here comes Paul having to try to somehow reverse this. An orgy can be non-sexual. It is simply a major indulgence of whatever you want. You could have an orgy of food with no sex involved. But in Greco-Roman culture, those feasts, the reason why it's translated as orgy is because their feasts would combine sex with feasts. Remember, they secluded the women, and then the men would go and have feasts and have sex with their boys. And so their feasts, especially with Zeus worship and idolatry and this ritual that they would have, the rituals always combined these feasts with pedophilia and Zeus worship and sacrifices and oxes and all these things. So Paul is not writing some generic warning for all future generations. And when it says sexual immorality and this stuff, yes, you can apply it because it's still applicable. And actually, it's more applicable than we think if we acknowledge how common pedophilia is in our society, which, because it's so taboo, we don't even talk about it. But he's actually trying to get them to snap out of their thinking, cast off the works of darkness, put on the armor of light, walk properly as in the daytime, not quarreling, not jealousy, not drunkenness, not feasting, and those orgies that you are familiar with, and the prostitution and the debauchery. He's trying to pull them out of Satan's grip. Quarreling and jealousy, all of that stuff, it's all right there. Paul had to teach liberation to a people who were already much too liberal. That's what's so amazing about what Paul is doing. You know, for the Jews who are under the law, it's all about strictness. He also had to create powerful restraints on these people without creating harsh laws or systems of punishment. How do you take somebody who, even though they're free from that culture, now they're part of the church, they have been, just like this still happens to this day, boys and girls who grow up being abused, they grow up feeling like that's just something their body wants. That's why, human trafficking is so common, because if you can get them young and abuse them like that, you can trap them in that system, and eventually they'll have Stockholm syndrome. They won't even want to leave. They'll just be so used to it. And if you let them go, they would prostitute themselves anyway. It's absolutely satanic to the core. And Paul has to come in and liberate them. This is where it says sin is bondage. The idea of chains, being locked up by your own lusts, being a prisoner of your own flesh, becomes more and more and more articulated, especially from Paul as he's trying to say the right thing without going too far, without establishing a legal system for punishing them, because they would just be killed in the old law. Homosexuality is an abomination that you would be killed for. Sodom and Gomorrah, God just burned down the whole city. But here he's trying to liberate them and get them to see the goodness of real Christian purity and desiring women and natural things instead of this unnatural cycle they're caught in. And he has to try to restrain them without creating laws. Impossible task. Amazing how he tried to pull it off. It's obvious why Jews would have despised the Gentiles. Think about this culture that the Jews are living under, why they would have felt so morally superior with their law. For as badly as they distorted the Old Testament law, think about how much better they were than that culture that we looked up in Wikipedia. So the Jews would have come by and definitely wanted to teach. I even feel like I want to go and teach. I want to time travel back then and teach these Greeks the Old Testament Leviticus law. I mean, that's my temptation as a Christian. I wish I could do it. Somehow, Paul had to come in and stop the Jews from doing that, saying, no, you don't need the law. Just liberate yourselves from your own sin, trust in Jesus, have grace, all the amazing teachings he had. It's confusing to the Jews because they can't understand why Paul, who was a Pharisee, would not want to use the righteousness of the law to teach the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are confused because they're hearing about this law from Jews, but Paul is saying, don't try to do the law, but also don't try to do what your Greek culture was doing that whole time, and what your own nature wants to do, and what your own flesh wants to do. It's such a crazy thing that he had to try to pull off. But God wanted to show the Jews that even these abominable Gentiles could be saved and receive the Holy Spirit by converting to Jesus, while Pharisees and legalists were excluded from that by their strict morality and unbelief. It's not because they were immoral, it was because their strictness was an unbelieving dogma. And they didn't feel like they needed Jesus, and now they're looking at these Gentiles, and they literally get the Holy Spirit. They're doing miracles. They're speaking in tongues. They're healing people. They have undeniable proof with miracles, and the Jews are the ones who say miracles confirm that something is legit. So the fact that these Greeks who came from that culture of pederasty and are not being taught the law are able to do stuff by the Holy Spirit that they can't, think about how that would gall them, how that would just drive them crazy. God wanted to prove something. That's how powerful Jesus is in the forgiveness of sins, and with the church that he was setting up, the 7 candlesticks. The Gentiles would be convinced that they had permission to do anything because of the grace of God. And that's one of the issues Paul constantly has to deal with. That's the natural temptation, is to say, oh, we're not supposed to have the law, and you said that we're free now because of Jesus. We're not condemned anymore. We were doing wrong, but now we're liberated. So that's their temptation. Or they would believe that they need to keep the old law to keep them obedient and free from sin. Paul warned about God's vengeance against the male prostitutes, pederasts, and those who commit abominations as Christians. But he gives this as a judgment day warning, not even a current day warning. So he says, basically, by the time you die, as soon as possible, get this sorted out. Stop living this way, because we don't know when the judgment day is going to be, and you're going to have to face the judge, and this is evil, and we've given you severe warnings about this. Unlike the heterosexual lovers that everyone thinks fornication means, these this type of prostitution, this Greek culture, that's where the serious warnings come in from Paul. And Paul is usually the one saying you can do many things. You have grace, and trying to lessen the legal burden. But when it comes to this, male homosexuality, pederasty, he does say this is a judgment day warning. You can go to Revelation and see that it confirms that. Specifically, those like prostitutes, male prostitutes. Meanwhile, the church is supposed to excommunicate, disassociate, and shun people who refuse to learn, but not kill them or punish them harshly. So, this is the tricky balance Paul was trying to get. Even the message of calling each other brothers and sisters is a clever way to discourage casual sexuality between them. Because even in Greek culture, incest was considered off limits. I got the same thing twice here. So he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you. They would have greeted themselves. You could see from that description in Wikipedia, they greet themselves with fondling and touching and all this other disgraceful stuff. He's saying just just kiss each other, the holy kiss, just a brotherly kiss. And, Greeks and Italians and stuff, they have, to this day, they don't mind doing that. But the concept of a familial or holy kiss was to contrast the unholy or lustful approach towards each other. It's obvious why the Greeks and Romans would have found Christians offensive and tried to lure them back into idolatry, orgies, prostitution, and their way of life. And I just want to go back to this idea of the brothers and sisters, because this was not just a universal term. Romans believed that Christians were committing incest because they would get married but still call each other brother and sisters, or they would call them brother and sister before they got married. And then people would be like, wait, they were calling each other brother and sister, but now they're married. So Christians commit incest. Paul was trying to get them to see each other as brothers and sisters so that they wouldn't feel comfortable having sex with each other. But obviously, the brothers and sisters get married in Christian culture, just like today. If we go to church and you see a single man and a single woman, they may call each other brother and sister, but if they fall in love and they get married, it was a term they used while they weren't interested in each other. But it's just very interesting that Paul basically went to an extreme and instituted that so that, because the Old Testament really uses the term neighbor, your neighbor, which always refers to your fellow man who is, like you. Brother and sister is an extra layer that I think Paul is using to try to cut off that temptation again because of how prevalent that was. So the next lecture is going to be about why would anyone cover this up? Where did the cover up start? Why did translations why do they still not properly explain what's going on in the New Testament? And that is going to be an interesting rabbit hole in itself. So thank you for watching. Sorry it was off-putting, but I think this is important stuff. I personally don't even really know what to make of it. I'm discovering this as I'm researching it. I decided to look into it, and I'd never expected to find this kind of stuff. Certainly not trying to justify myself in any way. And now I want to know, and I want to teach how important it is to try to get these warnings right. This is a new look at old warnings. So thanks for watching.